Hello, Wildcats. I'm Zaira Otayeb.
And I'm Molly Stitt.
And thank you for joining us on this
Word to the Wildcat podcast. We would like to introduce today's guest from the Wellness Center, Katie Parks.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Katie.
We would like to give listeners a heads up about today's podcast, as we will be talking about sexual assault and consent.
Yeah, so just so you all know, my name is Katie Parks. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the PATH advocate in the Wellness Center. So PATH stands for Prevention, Advocacy, Training, and Healing, and we provide support services to any CWU student who has experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, or harassment. We also provide services to partners or friends, any student who has been impacted by violence. And those services can look like advocacy, emotional support, connections to resources, and like they said, we are located in the Wellness Center, which has moved. We are now on the second floor of the CIRC in room 256. So that's how you can get connected with PATH.
So let's dive in, and can you share a little bit of background about this topic, Katie?
Yeah, I would be happy to. And I do just want to give another quick content warning. I will be using some words and talking about some things that can be tough for people. So at any point, anyone is welcome to turn off the podcast. But really what we know is that sexual assault on college campuses is unfortunately quite common. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, 1 in 4 college women will experience sexual assault during their time in college, and 1 in 13 college men will have that same experience. And actually, more than 50% of college sexual assaults occur in either August, September, October, or November, which is why it's called the red zone. And when we think about it, it makes sense because folks are new to college and to living on their own for the first time and probably don't have a lot of social connections yet, right? So they haven't had time to build those connections that can help protect them and people who can walk home with them and just help to check in on them and keep them safe. And so this is a really, important time to be talking about sexual assault on college campus because we know that it is so common, and especially during this time of the year. And actually, so at CWU specifically, in our most recent campus climate survey in 2020, 6% of respondents reported experiencing at least one incident of sexual misconduct. So we know that it's happening at CWU as well. And I just want to kind of start by going into some definitions of some of these things as well, which again might be heavy for folks. So just want to give that little warning. But really, at CWU, sexual assault is defined as non-consensual sexual intercourse, non-consensual sexual contact, incest, or statutory rape. And with consent meaning knowing, voluntary, and clear permission by word or action to engage in mutually agreed upon sexual activity. So to be a little bit more broad in my purview, my belief is that sexual assault is anytime anyone does anything of a sexual nature without the expressed consent of another person.
Yeah, it's that basic, no, that's not okay, or non-verbal cues a lot of the times. Don't have to say no. It can be just not making eye contact, shaking your head. It's anything not consensual, and it's unfortunate that so many people are experiencing this.
When speaking about consent, I also think it's important to talk about people who are pressured into it or change their mind halfway through it, because I think sometimes when talking about consent, the first thing that comes to people's minds is yes or no, and it's a bit more complex than that, especially if you say yes under pressure or if you change your mind during that situation. So can you talk a little bit about that, Katie?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you both bring up great points about consent, and really consent, we say it is an affirmative, verbal, enthusiastic yes, right? And there's a lot of things that do go into that. So Zaire, you brought up coercion, right? So if you're saying yes, but someone is coercing you, or you said no 10 times but they finally got you to give in and say yes, like that's not consent, right? So consent in the absence of coercion, force, threats, intimidation. Consent in the absence of incapacitation due to alcohol or drug use. Consent meaning giving a verbal yes every time for every sexual act. Consent being an ongoing conversation as well. I think a lot of times we can think of consent in a really transactional way, where it's like, do you consent to this activity, yes or no, and then you move on. But really, it should be an ongoing conversation before, during, and after the sexual activity.
I think it's also important when talking about consent that people know that it goes beyond like sexual intercourse, and it can, still go back to just like touching someone without permission or other forms of things that need consent. So can you talk a little bit about that, Katie, as well?
Yeah. So actually what we know from the data from our most recent campus climate survey is that, when we say 6% of respondents reported experiencing at least one incident of sexual misconduct, actually most of those incidents were non-consensual touching. And I think that you're right, that's something people don't necessarily think about as much, but really we do need to be getting consent for every step along the way. Even asking, like, can I kiss you? Is it okay if I put my hand here? Can I hold your hand? Just making sure that we are really respecting the other person's boundaries and bodily autonomy, because that's really what it comes down to, is just every individual has bodily autonomy, every individual has sexual citizenship. And so making sure that we are respecting that and being aware of the need to get consent for everything.
And you said sexual citizenship. Would you define that for the audience?
Yeah, so it's actually something that came out of a really incredible book called Sexual Citizens, which was a very large research study done at Columbia University in New York. And the researchers essentially found three main areas or definitions that kind of go along with, that contribute to sexual assault on college campus. And so the first one was sexual projects, and that is answering the question of what is sex for? Is sex for physical pleasure? Is it to be closer with the person you're having sex with? Is it to gain popularity and status? Is it for stress relief? All these different kind of reasons that people have sex. And so what's really important, the researchers found, is knowing what your sexual project is, and then being able to communicate that and have that conversation as part of a consensual sexual experience. Not only what are we consenting to in terms of what we're actually physically doing, but also like what's the reason we're doing it and what does it mean for our relationship. And then the second definition that they came up with is called sexual geographies. And so this is the spaces where sex happens, right? And so thinking about like dorm rooms, for example, being communal spaces. And so oftentimes when students are living in a dorm, the only space that they have access to that is solely their own is their bed. So if you invite someone to come over and the only space you can offer them is to sit on your bed, what does that mean? What does that look like? How are there potential problems with the communication when one person thinks an invitation to sit on my bed is an invitation for sex, and the other person, and we know that when we're talking about consent, asking someone to sit on your bed is not the same as giving consent. Consent still needs to be a verbal yes. So that's kind of the issue with sexual geographies. And then the last one is sexual citizenship. And so this is the idea that everyone has body autonomy and everyone has the right to decide what happens with their body, and recognizing other people's rights, right? So I have sexual citizenship and I recognize my autonomy and my ability to only have done to me what I want. And then I also recognize that in other people as well. And so when we think about sexual citizenship, it's just that mutual respect and that mutual understanding that everyone gets to make that decision, and we have to respect each other's decisions.
And when talking about the environment that people are in, and how individuals can perceive that as invitations, I think that's really important, because I think some individuals think that different environments and times, like for example, I feel like consent is very important just in like college parties as well. That's something that, is really widely discussed. I think some people think because you're in a party and it's like dark and things like that and everyone's in college that it's okay to just go up and touch people, but I think it's the same situation. Consent is required in all environments and places and things like that, especially when you were talking about the dorm and things like that. It's just kind of strange how people perceive like invitations into people's personal space as invitations for something else. So I think that's a really good point that you made.
The researchers did a lot of observations, and they found that people often, whether it was an invitation to sit on someone's bed in their dorm room, or being at a party, or being in a prior relationship, or all these different things, that people interpreted that as consent in practice, even though when they would go to these programs or class, they would be able to verbalize, well, nothing short of a verbal yes is consent. That wasn't actually being practiced. And so something for me as a prevention educator is, how do we make that jump from, okay, you can articulate what consent should look like, but do you have the skills to practice it? Because it is an everyday practice. It's an everyday skill.
I think that it's very important to talk about consent within relationships as well, because, the topic of entitlement comes up a lot, and people think because you kind of have that background or that relationship with someone that consent is no longer needed because can be an expected thing, but that's not the truth. So can you talk a little bit about consent in relationships and things like that?
Yeah. And I think consent can look different in longer term ongoing relationships. It can shift, but you're absolutely right that it still needs to be present, whether that's verbal, nonverbal, some sort of agreement or conversation that has happened. And really thinking about these ongoing conversations. And I think in a relationship, generally, you know more about your partner, you know more about what they like and what they don't like, and so sometimes there is less verbal communication that's needed, but things still come up, and there still should be ongoing conversations and checking in. Does this still feel good? Is this still something you want to do? Are you look kind of bored? Do you want to just cuddle instead? These are the kinds of things that I think we really struggle with as a culture, just in general, is that ongoing communication and what consent can look like in an ongoing fashion, and not just that initial verbal contract.
So Katie, can you talk a little bit about the resources offered here at Central and Ellensburg in general to kind of provide that support for people going through sexual assault situations?
Absolutely. And I think what I tell people when I do offer these resources is, even if you don't define what happened to you as sexual assault, even if you're just not sure if something kind of weird or uncomfortable happened, these resources are available to you in giving you a space to process that. So what we have at Central is PATH, which again stands for Prevention, Advocacy, Training, and Healing. And we are professional advocates who are trained to support students who have experienced any form of violence, including sexual assault. And we can provide advocacy, so helping connect folks with resources, helping to look at different accommodations that might be available through the university, whether that's housing or in classes. And just providing that emotional support, providing a space to vent and to process, and be a supportive presence. I also do want to just make it very clear that PATH is confidential. So for those who might not know, most employees at the university are responsible employees, which means that if they learn of any form of sexual misconduct or violence happening to someone, they need to report that to the university. PATH, on the other hand, is confidential. So when an advocate, such as myself, learns about something that has happened that falls under sexual misconduct, I don't have to make a report to the university. And that can be helpful for students who aren't sure if they want it to be reported to the university. PATH can be a space where students can process that and talk through the options and then decide. Other confidential resources that we have here on campus are student counseling services and student health services. And then off campus, we have our confidential domestic violence and sexual assault agency, which is called Aspen, and they provide 24/7 services. So they have a 24/7 hotline for anyone who's experienced violence, and they can also do legal advocacy, medical advocacy, including helping folks get sexual assault nurse exams, or sometimes called rape kits. And they're another wonderful resource in the community. And then finally, there are also some national resources. So the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network has a 24/7 hotline. There's a national domestic violence hotline. So there are lots of resources available to folks. And I will include all of this in the contact information for these resources. We can include that so folks have access to that.
Thank you for sharing those very important resources, Katie. Can you kind of walk through the process of someone maybe listening that would like to take that step and to report any form of sexual assault?
Yeah, absolutely. So really there are two places where folks can report a sexual assault. The first is to the university, to our Title IX office. And the process for making that report, first of all, I would recommend anyone who is considering making a report to talk with PATH first. PATH can provide information about the investigation process, answer any questions that folks might have, because it can be an intimidating process. And it's normal to feel anxious about it and just have a lot of questions about what the process is going to look like. So certainly getting connected with PATH is a great way to start. And then when folks are ready to make a report, they can either email our Title IX coordinator directly, or they can make a behavior of concern report and specify that it's for sexual misconduct. And then the other path that folks, not to make a pun, but the other path that folks can take is to report it to law enforcement, and then that would go through the criminal justice process. So again, I recommend folks talking with PATH or with Aspen first, just to get more information about the process, what it could look like, just having some of that advocacy available to them. And then the way to do that is to report it to law enforcement. And we have great police here at CWU and in Ellensburg. They actually have, CWU police has a commitment to survivors, I think is what they call it, but it's just their commitment to being trauma-informed and meeting survivors where they are and working with them in a empathetic and supportive way. And so if folks are interested, that is another option.
So when talking about reporting, any instant of sexual assault, I think it's important to talk about that there really is no time limitation on that subject, and that it doesn't matter if it happened yesterday or 6 years ago. It's important to talk about and advocate for yourself. So can you talk a little bit about how time shouldn't be a factor, and really when people are ready to talk about it, they should be able to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, I also just want to preface by saying that for myself as an advocate, I never push people, yes, you should report, no, you shouldn't report. My role is to present the options, to talk through some of the potential outcomes of reporting, and then to let folks make that decision for themselves, because ultimately my goal is to give power and control back to anyone I'm meeting with. So I do just want to preface by saying that sometimes reporting is the best option for some people and sometimes it's not. And really, ultimately, that is up to the individual. And certainly anyone who has experienced sexual assault in the past, recently, not recently, you are able to get help at any time. All of the resources are available to you no matter when it happened. And that is also the case with reporting. To be transparent, there might be less that the investigators can do because if it had happened a long time ago, but certainly it is never too late to report. It is never too late to share that with someone. I think what breaks my heart the most is when this happens to someone and they never tell anyone. Or they only tell one person and then they get a negative response and then they never tell anyone again. That absolutely breaks my heart because one of the most important paths to healing is to share with someone who is supportive and understanding and caring. And whether that's a friend or a family member or a professional advocate like myself, that is one of the best things that someone can do to help themselves heal. And certainly no one should feel like they have to carry that alone.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that and for all those great resources and paths for our students and community. We'll link them in the end for the folks watching or listening. I want to circle back to consent, and I'm thinking about normalizing saying no. And how can we normalize saying no and practicing this in everyday life? Whether work, school, like you were explaining, can be non-sexual, completely non-sexual, because consent is kind of basic. So how can we normalize it?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to the person who's putting out the request. So, for example, if I am requesting something from a group member on a group project, and I say to them, will you be able to do this? I think, to me, there's a couple things that I can do, right, to make sure that that I'm giving them the opportunity to say no. And the first is to say, can you do this for me? It's okay if not. Or it's okay to say no. Or can you do this for me? Or do you not have the time? Just giving them that, what I call giving people an out, giving people the opportunity to say, actually, yeah, I really don't have the time. Or I really don't feel like I'm the best person to do this part of the group project, or whatever the case is. And then the other piece of it is respecting that and saying, yeah, I hear you. Let's see if we can figure out another way to get this part done, or whatever the case is. And so really, when we're thinking about maybe even bringing that into a sexual sense, right? It's, do you want to do X, Y, and Z, or would you rather just cuddle? Or are you not really feeling up to it right now? Or are you kind of tired? I know you had a long day. And then if they take that out, respecting that and being gracious about hearing a no. And I think that really gives people the safety and the comfort in knowing that they can say no. Because I think what happens a lot of times is that coercion or that pressure, whether it's explicit or implicit, does the person really truly feel like they can say no? And sometimes that comes from power differentials too. If my boss is asking me to take on a project, do I really feel like I can say no? Or if someone who has more power or status than me is asking for something sexual, do I really feel like I can say no? Or if they're bigger than me, or if we're alone together, or if I don't know them very well, what are all of those peripheral factors that are impacting whether I feel like I can say no? And so just bringing more awareness to the power dynamics, I think, is another piece of really giving folks the ability and knowledge that they have the sexual citizenship and the power to say no.
So Katie, can you kind of talk about the proper response people should have or give to those who open up and share to them about their experiences with sexual assault and things of that nature, and what not to say to somebody that's opening up to you about that?
Yeah. To me, the number one thing that someone can do when someone else discloses that they've experienced sexual assault is just to listen. It can feel really tempting to ask questions because we're curious, right? Like, we want to know, like, where did it happen and who did it? And, you know, maybe we're asking questions like, what were you wearing, or how much were you drinking? And maybe we even have good intent behind those questions, but ultimately, when we're asking more and more questions, it can feel like an interrogation, and a lot of those things we don't need to know. All we need to know is what the survivor chooses to share with us. And in order to do that, we just need to listen. And there are some helpful things that people can say, like, I believe that this happened to you, because being believed is the number one factor in a survivor's recovery. Saying things like, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. That sounds like an awful experience, and I just want you to know that I'm here to support you in whatever way would be helpful. And ultimately that gets to giving power and control back, right? That's my charge as an advocate, and what I encourage folks to do when they find out that someone they know or they care about has experienced sexual assault is, how can you give them power and control over the situation, because that has been taken from them. So another thing that can be tempting is to tell them, oh, I'm going to take you to the hospital, we're going to get a rape kit, we're going to go to the police, we're going to, we're going to go report this, whatever the case is. But again, that's not always what's best for the survivor, and that's not always what they want, and they're not always ready for that, and maybe they will be at some point, or maybe they won't. And so just giving them the options, telling them, okay, well, one thing we could do is get a sexual assault nurse examination done, or we could go to the police, or we could report it to the university, or we could go to PATH, right? And so giving them the options, giving them resources, letting them know about PATH and Aspen and the national hotlines, and all the resources that are available to them, so they can make those choices in their own time.
I think that's a great point, kind of shifting the language from you should go to you could, or giving them the option, because it's not up to you, it's their journey.
Right.
So,
and then ultimately supporting them in whatever they choose. So if they do want to go to the hospital, great, let me drive you there, or let me get you connected with an Uber, and just letting them know that you're there to support them. And then because you are there to support them, and because that is emotionally draining, taking care of yourself too. That is something I cannot stress enough to folks who are supporting someone who's experienced sexual assault or any form of violence, is to take care of yourself, get therapy for yourself, go see PATH for yourself, because you are taking on that role that is so important and so incredibly compassionate and wonderful for the survivor, and it takes a toll. And so making sure that you are keeping yourself healthy so that you can continue to help and support them.
Katie, this has been a wonderful conversation and has given us a lot to think about as humans. As we start to wrap up, we want to create a space for you to just share anything else that you were hoping to let the listeners know, or what may be helpful later on.
Yeah, I think for me, it's twofold. So the first one really is just when you're thinking about consent in your everyday life, not just in sexual situations, just really examining your practices and how you're using consent and how you can be better, because we can all do consent better in our everyday lives, in sexual situations, in relationships. We can all do consent better. And so just thinking about how you as an individual can do consent better and contribute to a culture that has better communication and better practices around consent. And then the second piece that I would say is, if you have experienced sexual assault, if you are not sure, if you had an experience that just didn't feel right, that you are unsure about, connect with the resources that we mentioned earlier, because we are here to support you. We are here to help you process. We are here to connect you with the resources and the accommodations and the support that you need, and you don't have to go through this alone.
Thanks for tuning in, Wildcats, on our episode with Katie. Thank you so much, Katie, for coming in.
Thank you.
Streaming is available on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Google, and 88.1 The Berg.
And make sure to tune in to our next episode. We will be discussing professional development. Thank you again, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me.